Obviously not this week or next week. Okay, so because we had the discussion on the paper that's due on Tuesday, last Tuesday, I put up some makeup lectures to make up for what we didn't talk about in class. And so there's two sort of shorter screencasts on Canvas, right? Did I write you and tell you I'd put those up or not? I don't think I did I? So I can't be mad at you for not having looked at them yet. So look at those, right? They're on the Canvas page in sequence. And what they talked about was what wrapped up what was left of Dada, which was a couple of places in Germany, a couple more places in Germany. We were looking at Berlin, I think, when we left off. And then there was one that talked about the spread of Dada into America and how it's impacted or influenced later American art, right? And so there's this movement called Precisionism that begins sort of in the early 20s, very, very precise renderings of architectural scenes, right? Based somewhat on commercial illustrations, but also very much based on the sort of precise mechanical renderings of the Dada group, particularly the Dada New York group. Picabia and Duchamp were doing these very, very precisely rendered machines that looked very much like commercial illustrations. And a number of other artists picked up on this, and it's all because people like Charles Sheeler knew our old friend Alfred Stieglitz, that great photographer and gallery operator in New York, who really almost single-handedly helped bring modernism to America, right? And he ended up introducing other artists to the European avant-garde. And in fact, remember, I mentioned before that Stieglitz had hosted the very first Picabia show, and he actually showed Sheeler Picabia works, right? So there's a direct connection. And we see a group of artists that are very much influenced by that sort of machine aesthetic that's coming out of Dada. They don't have the same purposes, right? They're not really worried about making an anti-art in the way that Dada was, but the form is there, right? A very formal influence. Another group is influenced by Dada in a kind of different way, and that's the regionalist group. And they still are fairly realistic looking. Here's Eberhard, right? But what they're doing is they're kind of reacting against European modernism. So there's two ways that you can be influenced by something, and one is to follow in its footsteps. The other one is to try to do something entirely different. And the regionalists in America in the 20s and 30s were doing something very different. They were clinging to an older style of realistic art, the kind of Ashcan school, 19th century realism. And Hopper sort of falls into that. And we call them regionalists because the works really evoke a particular region of America. Hopper, New York City, but also Cape Cod. Others are mostly Midwestern, right? They're realists, but they're not precisionist in the same way. It's not about the machine or the buildings themselves. It's about people, right? And regional activity. So these were reactions to Dada, and these came up on those lectures that are up on Canvas to make up for Tuesday's discussion about art. And then we looked at the spread of Dada, how Dada after 1920 really spread everywhere in Europe. Very, very influential movement. And we'd left off talking about Berlin, but it spreads to Hanover, to Cologne, right? Numerous centers in Germany. That's because Germany doesn't have a single art center like Paris or something like that, right? There are numerous, and we talked about that before when we looked at German Expressionism, right? They're kind of all over the place. But Kurt Schwitters is sort of the one-man Dada show in Hanover. There are artists working in Cologne as well. I'm a big fan of Kurt Schwitters. I think these are just wonderful pieces. So that's all on the online discussion, right? What we're going to trace today is the other sort of outgrowth of Dada. And there was these American movements that either followed it or reacted against it, but there was a huge European movement, very much influenced by Dada. It's a huge impact, right? And through the rest of the 20th century, Dada has a massive impact because it's an art of ideas, right? And those ideas are picked up by artists everywhere. And both Man Ray in New York, right, Emanuel Radnitsky, and Max Ernst, who was Dada Cologne, Köln in Germany, right? Both of them moved to Paris in the early 1920s, right? And in Paris, just after 1920, there is a Dada Paris movement going as well. Begins almost immediately after the war, and these Dada artists elsewhere begin to sort of supercharge it, right? They get it really moving. So Max Ernst is coming in with his ideas about rubbings, making rubbings, and using those as an open start, in which he finds forms and then emphasizes them. Again, very Dada in outlook, right? It's just rubbings of sidewalks or wall, woodwork on the walls or whatever. And then once he does these overlaid rubbings, he starts to find patterns emerging within it. And then we'll come back over the top and draw on it to emphasize those patterns from that open start, right? And of course, it's Dada in the sense of being found objects, right? Juxtapositions that lead us somewhere, right? Man Ray we talked about in class, these quasi-humorous post-Duchamp objects with these great titles, Object to be Destroyed, that then got destroyed, so he made it as the Indestructible. So they're there. They're helping with the ideas that are Dada Paris. Well, in 1924, the Dada Paris group was subsumed, swept up into what's now known as Surrealism, right? They basically become the Surrealists. Dada Paris does. And all of the artists that began as Dada artists that are working in Paris now become Surrealist artists working in Paris. What's the difference other than 1924? What happened in 1924 that makes us think of the Surrealists as being any different from Dada Paris? Because some of them are the same artists. The difference is philosophy. The difference is a codified set of ideas that are put forth as psychological, philosophical tenets, beliefs. Dada didn't believe in anything, right? They're kind of anarchical, right? They believed in making art that wasn't art, right? They believed in contradicting themselves. They believed in making fun of tradition. But the Surrealists have a manifesto, and it's based on social science. It's based on psychology, right? It's based on a sort of in a strangely rational point of view, which sets them apart sort of from the Dadaists. But it relates to what Dada artists were doing enough that they were able to sort of sign on to this. So the whole idea of Surrealism came out of a manifesto. I love this portrait, right, with the paper around his face. And don't these things make you want to have Halloween again? Go find a pair of goggles on eBay and then cut out some paper, right? I one time went to a Halloween party as a Xerox of myself. I laid on the Xerox machine, Xerox my head on all four sides and put them on a box on my head, right? Xerox my hands, right? And it was a drinking party, so I had to have my hands free, so I just had the hand on the other. But I was like the alternate Mark, right, at the party. And I got the idea sort of looking at modern art, a replica of myself, right? And I wore a black suit with white. So I was a black and white me, right? Anyway, that's a stupid aside. There's André Breton. He wrote the Manifesto of Surrealism in 1924. And the fact that they've got a manifesto is something that the Dadaists would never do, right? They may have ideas that they share that we talked about as we looked at them, but they would never go so far as to write a manifesto. And Breton's manifesto applies to all of the arts, not just visual art, but it's meant to apply to music, poetry, right, literature, theater practices. And a lot of it does come out of Dada. But the thing is that Breton thought that Dada had gotten too commercial. Right? They were making works of art to be sold, and they sort of lost sight of their original, what made them interesting at the start. And he wanted to sort of get back to the roots. And in writing the manifesto, Breton calls Surrealism a philosophy, right? And in his words, he says that what a Surrealist does is he searches for a superior reality. right? Now, superior in French is sur, above, right? Sur la table, on the table, right? You know that from marketing, right? Cookware. Surreal means above reality. So looking for a superior reality of forms. And here's where the psychology comes in. He says that this can be found in dreams. So there's this sort of Freudian interest in dream analysis, right? And again, that's social science, right? That's science. That's something the anti-rationalist Dadaists would have rejected out of hand, right? In dreams, we can find a superior reality of form, right? That's the basis of surrealism, is looking for some form that is superior to the forms in the physical world. And that's not different from anybody, right? Going all the way back to Kandinsky, right? It's not really different from what we've been talking about, a superior reality to the objectively perceived world. And that's been behind everything we've looked at, going Matisse, it's everywhere, right? So obviously these ideas of looking to dreams for the superior is based directly on Freud, right? Sigmund Freud. And certainly the Surrealist Manifesto and the Surrealist ideas are deeply indebted to Freud's ideas that dreams can allow us to find our true selves, right? Through dream analysis. We understand our true motivations, right? Like all of our hang-ups in everyday life can be sort of solved if we can figure out what motivates us to be so hung up about stuff, right? And dreams are one way to get there because you function in an illogical state in your dreams, and when you get past the logic and the constraints of logic, you can find that inner, true, hidden motivation, right? This is what he calls the subconscious, right? Below your conscious state lie your true emotions, and there are kind of two basic ways to get there, and these will be picked up by our surrealists. One is through dreams, and the other is through childhood, and those both come directly out of Freud, right? Go back and try to recall your suppressed memories of childhood, and that should give you a clue as to why you're so screwed up today, right? Or why you want to break down and cry whenever you see the color green, right? You can figure that out by analyzing these things, right? So, logic and reason to Freud block our true primal desires, right? And we need to get past that. And that idea of getting past logic to get to something superior is a very Dada thought as well. They're very anti-logic in their own way, but they would never go so far as to base it on social science, right? Now, both Freud and André Breton used a technique to try to reveal the subconscious. They called it automatic writing. And the idea is you just put pen to paper and start writing, free writing. No sort of prompt, no sort of subject matter. Just let your mind wander and write down whatever your mind is wandering to. Dinner last night, pebbles on the ground. Free writing and free association, right? With the writing. And what Freud said is that this would actually express the true function of thought in the absence of reason. Right? It would get to who you truly are. It would get to your subconscious. So if we think about this idea of automatic writing, it's an open start that you then connect the dots, right? You then figure out what are some patterns I'm seeing here, or your therapist would, right? Figure out what are the patterns I'm seeing here as your mind is wandering around. You're drawing connections between things that don't have any connection in an illogical way. And all of a sudden, this should just sound like that's Dada. That's Duchamp's bicycle wheel, connected to a stool with no logical way, right? Or even the idea of automatic writing. It's an open start. Well, so is Max Ernst, right? Doing these rubbings. They're open starts that allow him then to develop ideas out of what just seems to happen there, almost subconsciously, right? See things that no one else can see in the world around him, right? So automatic writing is an important element of early surrealism, because the idea is that they're going to be using something you create to get to your subconscious, right? Your sublimated emotions and motivations. And some of our early surrealists, sorry, this is being slow today. Try that again. Yeah, some of our early surrealists did what was called automatic painting. We'll find quite a few surrealists are very much interested in automatic painting. André Masson, well in advance of Jackson Pollock, just starts squeezing glue and paint onto the canvas from a height. Again, very Dada, isn't it? Letting it drop where it will on the canvas. He throws sand into the wet glue and sand into the wet paint. And you can see some of it here, right? And then as that happens and he begins to see the patterns emerging, he begins then to look for connections. Look for things that might be there. And in this case, he sees two people taking a stroll. And I think you can begin to pick that out. He doesn't mean stroller like a baby carriage, right, like a pram. He means strollers as in taking a nice little afternoon walkabout, right? And he doesn't want it to be realistic. He doesn't want to bring it out. He's just seeing evocations of this within this open start, right? I think it's a wonderful exercise to think about, right? I remember when I was I was getting my studio art degree back in the day, and we did something similar, but we had a sumi brush with ink, and we were just making marks on the page and having them overlay, and then you would stop and look and see if the negative space was becoming anything in between these brush strokes that you have on the paper. And it was a wonderful assignment. It's very freeing, right? Because it gets you to this place where you're not worried. And this was, for me, it was good because I'm too tight as a draftsman. And it allowed you to sort of just begin to be much more creative and free your creative juices. For the surrealists, it got to what they thought was something more profound than just that, right? More profound than freeing your dexterity, right? They think of it as actually embracing your subconscious, right? Analyzing yourself. Art as a form of personal analysis, right? It's going to be one of those days. There. One of my favorite pieces of the 20th century, Max Ernst. So there's, under the influence of Breton, after 1924, Ernst begins to investigate dream imagery, right? And certainly comes up with works of art that evoke sort of the nocturnal landscape of dreams. Although it's hard to say, is it day or night, right? It doesn't really clarify that. It could be either. It's a sort of dusk, dawn sort of look. Notice that both of them, you can tell us by the title, relate to birds, right? The conjugal diamonds. What he's found in there are two what look like peacocks. Not peacocks, pigeons embracing, right? Sort of snuggling together. And, Dada artists are always all about sex anyway, so, okay, that's fine, right? And over here we've got a threatening nightingale. Doesn't look very threatening, but there it is right above the gate, painted in the sky. And birds are very important to Ernst, and there are two things that come together that's perfectly surreal about it. It relates to his childhood, and it relates to a dream he had when he was a child. Like when he was 10 or something, he had measles. Horrible fever, right, in bed for weeks with the measles. And in the middle of the disease, he had this dream, like this half-waking dream, where he looked at the room around him and he started looking at the wood paneling on the walls. And all of a sudden, the grain of the wood with the knots and whatnot started turning into things because he's, fevered, right? And he's hallucinating. And all of a sudden he sees a bird, right, in the grain of the wood. And then he sees two children down below that the bird's, going to kill. And this is, is frightening. He never forgot it, he said, right? This frightening dream of children being menaced by a bird. And throughout his career, birds become a major theme that he keeps reiterating. He even called himself a bird sometimes in his writings, right? he had a name for himself, Lop Lop, the Bird King, which I thought was kind of funny in itself, right? But the conjugal diamonds, right? The two pigeons there being taken out of, again, patterns he sees around him. All of a sudden, within the patterns, he sees birds, right? That emerge from that pattern as he works on it. And here, a recollection. He said this is a direct recollection of that dream that was inspired by the wood grain of the bedroom, that we have figures being threatened by a bird, right? So it's an assemblage of found objects. That's a Dada lesson now being applied in a surrealist work of art, right? They've been tacked together and painted up, right? And they've been placed inside of a three-dimensional box, right? The glass on the surface is on the outward surface of this, and everything is then behind the glass, right? So it's quite deep, 3 or 4 inches deep, this shadow box, if you will. And on the back of that, I'm assuming it's a found frame, right? He's applied a piece of wood that he's painted on and attached the objects to. So the gate-like form that opens outward actually does open outward, right? It comes out toward us because it runs up the inner part of that frame, right? And these are all sort of constructed out of junk that he's found, or a doorknob, right? A blue doorknob, pieces of wood. But he's also painted it, right? It's not just an assemblage. It's a doctored assemblage, right? And the gateway, on a certain level, is intended, I think, as an invitation to us. The gate is open and we can go in, and you can see that the landscape is painted, some of the paint's really quite thick, right? Very thickly applied, where almost as if that grass, he's almost like he's trying to make it look like earth by building it up thickly, right? And we have this plunging perspective that drops way back to these buildings that are only sort of lightly drawn in. And the buildings, in my notes, I say they're meant to evoke long lost and far away places, right? An Arc de Triomphe out of ancient Rome. But he's in Paris, so there's an Arc de Triomphe in Paris as well, right? So it may not be that. But then something behind it that looks almost quasi-Islamic, like a mosque with a minaret, right? And again, deeply distant from the figures. They're so small in comparison, right? The plunging artificial perspective, right? That is the sort of kind of perspective of dreams. And then against this brightly colored and sort of naturally colored sky, grass and vegetation, we have these black and white figures that look almost like cutouts from a distance, but when you get up close, you see he's left that area without the thick green paint on it so that they can look more flat as well. And we have one figure that's collapsed and one figure with a knife. And in this detail, it looks like a murder scene, right? Like the figure with that monster chef's knife has just killed somebody and is running away. And Ernst plays with this kind of duality of meaning, right? Because if the title, Two Children, and it's written, right? Deux enfants sont menacés. 2 children are menaced by a nightingale. Then are these the 2 children? And has the one on the ground simply fainted? And the one on the left, her face upward toward the bird, preparing to fight back against the menacing nightingale. Again, it's not entirely clear, right? Like dreams, it's a little illogical. Things mean multiple things, right? It gets all over the place. Right? But there is this sense almost as if that figure is running away from the other figure, having done some evil. And there's a sort of evil foreboding over the entire thing because there's another figure almost like dancing on top of that. Almost looks like a message kiosk, doesn't it? The sort of thing you go see, community bulletin board sort of thing. And I'm not quite sure what that object is that's tacked onto it there. But up top we have another black and white figure running and sort of defying gravity as he runs. And he's got a child in his arms. And again, there's that duality of meaning. Is he saving the child from the nightingale? Is he escaping the danger? Or is it a kidnapping? And it sort of looks like both, doesn't it? You could read it either way. And I like the way that he seems like he's reaching out to grab that doorknob as if he's trying to get the hell out of here, right? I want out of this dreamscape. I want to wake up and move away, right? So Ernst investigating dreams, right? And finding within them, going back to his childhood, right? Childhood dreams, he's finding within them menace, fear, right? Either way you read it, there's that sense of fear and menace. When the National Gallery opened up their East building after renovating it 2 years ago, they brought this out of storage. I'd never seen it before. I've been here for 10 years. I'd never seen it. It's a spectacular picture. It's, 10 feet across the base? 10 and a half feet across the base? 128 inches, you do the math, right? And it's just extraordinary. It's much later in his career, obviously. It's 15 years down the pike. He's still in France at this point. And the title, Moment of Calm, probably refers to the political situation in France because France was leaning right, hadn't yet been overthrown by the Nazis, right? And Max Ernst had actually been arrested as an undesirable alien because he's German, right? So the French government doesn't want him there because of the Germans. And then when the Germans come in 1941, he's arrested again by the Germans because he's a modernist artist, right? At this point, he says, I'm done here, and he goes to New York, right, where he married Peggy Guggenheim, right, in New York, and spends the last of his career in New York City because of this. So the idea of the moment of calm may be that within the act of painting, especially something as large as this, which really creates an environment, right? Think 12 feet. It's like those 3 windows, right? The first 3 window bays. It's about that big, right? He's creating for himself a moment of calm, right? Some sort of escape from the world around him, which is increasingly crazy, right? Being arrested for being a German by the French, and then being arrested by the Germans for just being an artist, right? Well, the entire work is really wonderful, right? I think it's entirely done with a palette knife. And it sort of pulls in everything that Ernst had been doing insofar as this interest in rubbing surfaces to get patterns. In this case, he's scraping through layers of paint. I look at this again and again, and I can't really figure it out, right? It does seem as if he's got color over color over color that he scrapes away without smearing, right? Just revealing the colors underneath. And that as he's doing that, as he's working the paint in these with his palette knife, forms begin to appear. And again, guess what? They're birds, right? And everywhere we look in this, it's maybe hard to see at first, but we find these dreamy, bird-like forms that he will pick out and then sort of enhance in the same way he did when he was working with rubbings as a Dada artist. Love that. Right? The head on that is just extraordinary. The colors are. I can spend hours looking at this thing, right? And I think he's come over the top of those with some of this sort of the black that you see is laid over on the top of it with the palette knife. But again, we just get these pairings of birds, and I don't know if I doubt these are meant to be menacing. The title doesn't suggest that. The bird's not always something bad for him, right? But bird imagery does seem to dominate a lot of what he did in his surrealist works. Try it again. There we go. Right? Over on the right, a sort of chubby sumo wrestler dancing bird with a yellow eye. But again, that's the way in which they sort of emerge from and then sink back into the landscape is again this, right, automatic writing. That you start open and then you see what happens and you see where it leads you. Where it leads you is something that is who you really are, right? It's a key, an avenue to your subconscious. And that's exactly what Ernst is doing here, right? Again, just what a terrific picture, right? And just, I'm inspired to try effects I would never have thought of after having seen this. And again, unable to explain exactly how it all worked out, right? But for him, of course, there's this idea of I think, escapism. It's a dreamscape, right? That's a thing we'll see a lot in surrealists, is this a dreamy landscape where the moon takes on a anamorphic sort of essence. Things float around in the sky that aren't really explained, sort of, again, these anamorphic amoeba-like forms, right? And he's scratching through, right, to discover these forms as they emerge. Well, the artist we most associate with surrealism is Dali, Salvador Dali. And we also really most associate this idea of a dream landscape with Dali as well. I'm not a big fan of Dali. I think he's okay at first. But later on, when he starts signing any piece of paper that came in front of him and calling it art, I guess there's a Dada thing to that, but it never really impressed me that much. But certainly you can't talk about surrealism without talking about Dali. This is in Museum of Modern Art, by the way. And it's also in a box, right? In a little crafted box. And it's only about like this big, right? It's deceptively small. Every time I go there, I'm very surprised by just how tiny it is. Now, Dali, while he's the quintessential surrealist, almost everybody's the one name you associate with surrealism, he actually came to the game pretty late. Right? Surrealism started in 1924. And arguably, surrealism started a bit earlier with our Paris Dada people, right? Who transformed into surrealism in 1924. But Dali doesn't get to Paris until 1929, right? So that's 5 years into the game. That's after Max Ernst's Nightingale picture that we just saw. That had a similar sort of dreamy dawn-dusk landscape that's neither here nor there, right? That suggests the world of dreams. Dali's picking up, I think, from these ideas. Right? He, however, like the surrealists, he's engaged with these ideas about mining his dreams and his childhood for meaning, for entrance into his true nature, into his subconscious, right? And in this particular case, he's mining childhood memories for subconscious meaning. The landscape that you see here, and you see it's fairly realistically drawn in the background, right? The foreground, there's nothing there, right? There's just an edge by the water, the base of something on the left, right? A table with the soft clocks, right? A dead tree growing out of the table, that thing, right? But other than that, there's not much on the landscape, right? But in the background, then we look past that across the water where it looks like the setting sun is hitting it. It's relatively realistically drawn, and in fact, most surrealism tends to be more realistically drawn, right? And that landscape in the background is part of the Costa Brava in Spain, where he grew up, the Cap de Cruz. I don't know quite how to pronounce that because I don't speak Spanish, right? But it's this beautiful part of the Spanish coastline, sort of near the French border, and with these extraordinary rock formations, right? And this is near Barcelona, right? And this is where Dali grew up. Right? So the landscape in the background with the huge bay is meant to evoke the Mediterranean and his memories of these rocky capes that jut out into the ocean. And the interesting thing about the Cap de Cruz, it has these extraordinary rock formations that are all over the place. And this one is that, isn't it? Right? And we think that and now that, by the way, if you go there's a National Dali Park, and you can walk around, and they have the Dali picture next to the rock that inspired it, right? The different and various ones around. But there are numbers of these large, very, very large rock formations. I don't know if they're lava or if they're just worn away limestone, right? But they're anamorphic. And we think that these are what helped inspire Dali to give us these sort of forms that morph from one thing into another, right? Things that are solid are depicted as if they're soft. Because these are rocks that looked as if they'd been molded, as if they were once soft, right? And Dali seems to channel those memories of things he had seen in Spain growing up. The other thing about that object that was inspired by the rock is that if we turn it on its side, it becomes a face. And you can see there's a nose, right, with something coming out of it, eyelashes, right, a mustache. It's him. It's a self-portrait, right? Dali had that really profound sort of hook nose. And later in his life, of course, he did the craziness with his mustache, but he's already twirling it here, right? And it got all the way out sort of, 5-6 inches from his ears by the end of his life. I know, it's turn around and hurt people, right, with all the wax in the nose. But here he is shortly after coming to Paris, around the same time as this picture. And you can see that is intended to be, what do you want to say, a transformed self-portrait, right? Where, again, like the soft watches, he's taking something solid and he's turning it into something soft, right? Something more pliable than the original object. Now, what's fascinating is that I think it looks like a mask almost, doesn't it? It almost looks like it's if you were to go to a Halloween store and buy a Dali mask and then throw it on the ground, drape it over, there's a little ridge of rock there. If you drape it over something, that's what it would look like, right? It looks like a mask rather than anything else. And if we think about what surrealism is, which is this looking to your childhood, your subconscious to discover identity, right? Well, this is an important thing because when Dali was born, he was the second son to his parents, and the first son had already died, right? So he was born as the first surviving son, but the second son of his parents. And the first son was named Salvador. And Dali was given the name of his dead older brother, which apparently just messed him up for the rest of his life. Like, he talked about it all the time, that he was a replacement for his brother. That he said, what is the word? He said, I was a double. I was an absence rather than a presence. Right? He was not who he was somebody else. And if we think about this idea of the self-portrait as a mask, an empty mask, then this childhood memory of feeling like an absence, right? Feeling like a double, feeling like a replacement, an imposter, playing the role of someone else, fits perfectly with how he's illustrating himself here in his single most famous picture. Now, of course, with the idea of memory, and the persistence of memory, what's the memory that's persisting for him? Is it this memory of childhood, this memory of his... But the interesting thing is that memories persist where nothing else does, where solid things don't persist. And he uses flies and ants on the different watches. That's a closed stopwatch, right, with the cover closed. The red one is. The flies and the ants are meant to suggest rotting, right? Decomposition. And that things pass away, but what lasts through time is memory. Memory of his childhood, of the Cap de Creuse, of his identity as a replacement figure, as an imposter. About the best Dali in this particular area is down in Richmond. We've got a couple in the National Gallery, but they're significantly later, and I think they're kind of cheesy. So I brought this one in instead, The God of the Bay of Roses. And again, the typical Dali surrealist landscape, right? That dreamy landscape that with the heightened perspective, right? We saw that in Max Ernst as well. That's probably part of where Dali got it after coming to Paris. Human figure on the left, statue floating above its base, people worshiping it down below. and next to the statue, a rock from which it could have been carved, because it's kind of the same proportion and shape. This again goes back to this area where he grew up. The Bay of Roses is an actual place on the Costa Brava near the Cap de Creuse. And it was originally settled by Greeks back in 600 BC. And there are the ruins of a Greek settlement there, right? Including the statue. Now, I don't know when that statue was put up, right? I just found some tourist photos of the Bay of Roses. It could have been there when Dali was there. I don't know for sure. I looked everywhere on Google Earth looking for that rock, right? It's not to be found. Certainly not on that scale, right? So he's not really trying to recreate exactly what this looks like, but he is sort of interested in this idea of ancient religion, right? The God of the Bay of Roses, of a far-off time and a far-off land and the remnants that are left for us. It's a land of memory. It's a land of dreams, right? And the figure, like I said, floats directly above the pedestal down below. The figure is androgynous. It has male genitalia, but the face is a young girl's. In fact, the face is his wife, right? Her name is Gala. Creepy in itself, isn't it? And then I have no explanation for the hole in his chest. I don't know if Dali would want me to have one. You know? He's playing with reality, wanting us to see more in this than the physical world around us. Right? And, of course, it's being worshipped by idolaters down below. And the figures around it with these sort of elongated forms, rather stretched out and attenuated, somewhat bulbous in the anatomies, rubbery hinds or arms or legs, right? But very gestural, very expressive as they move and dance. And you wonder if he's not thinking about the Old Testament and the children of Israel dancing around the golden calf, the false idol, when Moses comes down with the Ten Commandments. The landscape itself does weird things, doesn't it, as you look at it? I've not seen this in person. These are all internet download pictures. But it looks as if as we watch the scene that it begins to transform before our eyes, almost like a Max Ernst, right? And I keep trying to make that cloud and the formation in the cloud, right? We've seen in other Dalis where solid things turn soft. And here all of a sudden the cloud looks like it's turning hard, almost like it's mirroring the shape of the rock on the other side, right? Again, he's playing with reality, right? The figural style is also very Spanish, and I think Dali is channeling a lot of ideas here. These elongated gestural figures go back to probably the single most famous Spanish artist from his childhood, El Greco, the great Mannerist Baroque painter. And indeed, some of the figures here sort of remind me of the God of the Bay of Roses. Look at the pose of Christ. I doubt he's looking at this one specifically, but the sort of striding forward, that elegant stride forward, somewhat reminds me of Christ, and then the figures down below it as well. But they have that same sort of elongation and attenuation and activity that we see in Dali. He's picking it up from looking at El Greco. This is his Spanish heritage. And again, this is what Surrealism encourages us to do, right? Mine our heritage, mine our past, and hopefully through that discover our subconscious. Well, he's picking up this style from all over the place. Like I said, he arrived fairly late in Paris, and there were quite a few other surrealists already active in Paris. And many of them, we already saw Max Ernst, were trafficking in this sort of strange, dreamlike landscape, right? And Yves Tanguy had already had a retrospective in Paris in 1927. He was a very well-established surrealist artist when Salvador Dali arrived. And this landscape, which again, is it nocturnal, is it dawn or dusk, that puts us somewhere that's at the same time nowhere. Comes directly out of, or is exactly where Dali got his ideas, right? And again, Tanguy is giving us some automatic painting. We've got, in addition to this landscape he's created, he's then gone back in and just sort of hammered down with some paint and then paints shadows for them so they seem to float over the top of the landscapes. And some of them sort of turn, I don't know, microbes or something across the surface, but they seem to float. It always reminds me of something like out of a science fiction book, right? It's like a lunar landscape or something. And Dali's strange, otherworldly landscapes owe so much to the artists that he encountered when he got to Paris in 1929. So late to the scene, but sort of co-ops the entire movement, right? He's the one that we associate with it. But the ideas that he has are not necessarily unique to Dali, although certainly in fitting with what the Surrealists are doing. Another basis for Dali's style is an earlier painter still, Giorgio de Chirico. De Chirico's work, as you can see, even predates the Surrealists by a significant amount of time, right? He would not have called himself a Surrealist artist because the term hadn't been coined yet. This is 11 years before the Surrealist Manifesto. Right? He had come to Paris from Italy back in 1911. If you think back on what we've covered in this class, you might think, oh, that's the same time the Futurists came. Right? 1911 was the founding of the Futurist movement. They're also there for a big show in 1912. The Futurists are gathering in Paris. De Chirico's an Italian at the same time, but he's not a Futurist. In fact, he has nothing to do with them, and he works almost entirely in isolation in Paris. He calls these paintings that almost no one else is doing. He calls them metaphysical paintings. Right? That's his term for his style. Now, like I said, the term surrealism didn't exist, but if we deconstruct these two terms, metaphysical, surrealism, right? They both mean exactly the same thing. Physical and realism, right? Same thing. So, realism, surrealism, above realism. Metaphysical, meta means outside of or above as well, right? So a metatextual comment is a comment on a comment, right? This is a metaphysical painting, a painting of a world above the physical world, beyond the physical world, right? When Breton, in 1924, started Surrealism, he started looking back to see who else had been doing this sort of stuff. And he sees de Chirico and he goes, this guy is a surrealist, right? He's just there ahead of the game. Right? And if he were making paintings now, we would join him in our group. Right? And Breton, the founder, even owned pictures by de Chirico, right? Had them in his collection as he founds surrealism. Now the title is elusive, right? The Soothsayer's Recompense, right? In other words, the prophet's reward, right? The soothsayer's recompense. How is a prophet rewarded? I don't know if he wants us to know. I'm not sure that the meaning is meant to be anything other than mysterious and inspirational. But he gives us, again, like we've seen in so many of these, a strange perspective, architecture that's evocative without delineating, strong source of light with shadows that are themselves somewhat mysterious. Things that happen that aren't explained. A train going nowhere, right? 3 minutes to 2 in the afternoon or the middle of the night. Either way, the light's all wrong, isn't it? For 3 minutes till 2, right? There's never that kind of dark at 2 o'clock. We see through this one archway to the palm trees in the background. That gives it a sense of sort of a Mediterranean kind of look, and then we have the statue in the foreground. Do you recognize the statue? We've seen it 3 or 4 times, right? It's Matisse's favorite statue, right? The one that he did, the blue nude was based on this same statue. It's a statue of a dreaming figure, a figure who's asleep, right? The sleeping Ariadne from Hellenistic Greek art. This is the basis of that statue. De Chirico would have known it from his days in Italy, but it certainly ties into the theme, the surrealist theme, right, of dreams. Now, Freud is writing, right, back in the 1880s, 1890s. So we don't need Breton to bring Freud to people's attention, right? We already talked about the fact that Klimt, Gustav Klimt, the symbolist artist, right, was very much influenced by Freudian ideas because he was working in Vienna at the same time that Freud was alive. So other artists are definitely engaged with Freud's ideas. Munch, Edvard Munch, right? Deeply engaged with these ideas. And so even though Breton championed Freud so strongly, it's not like he started anything, right? In an artistic interest in the subconscious, in dreams, in what we can find by analyzing dreams or creating dreamlike atmosphere. That had been going on already, right? And De Chirico is solid proof of that, right? Well, it's an illogical space, isn't it? The wind blows to the left. See that from the flags, but the steam from the engine's blowing behind it. Not sort of up in the air as it would be if it was caught from the wind behind it. And then there's no wind whatsoever hitting the trees behind that. It's all just very strange. And at the same time, wonderful. Most De Chiricos look like this, although he lives all the way till the 1930s. But he's a great sort of influence on Dali when he arrives in Paris, right? Because this is where De Chirico was working. As we're looking at other proto-surrealists, right? I couldn't fit this guy anywhere else. So he's another proto-surrealist like De Chirico. He's got nothing really to do with Dali. And that's, back up, I'm ahead of myself. Sorry about that. One more thing about the ideas that De Chirico's working with. Even though Freud is obviously of primary importance, when De Chirico wrote about his pictures, he said that he was as much influenced by the writings of Nietzsche. We've talked about Friedrich Nietzsche before, right? When we looked at the bridge, Die Brücke, right? We talked about Nietzsche's, the late 19th century philosopher, who writes about sociological evolution, right? And gives Kirchner the idea that if we can figure out where we've evolved from, we can take the next evolutionary step, right? So we've evolved from apes to where we are now, but we'd be stupid to think that that process is done, that we're the best we'll ever be, that we could get to the next step where we would be Superman, right? This is what Nietzsche writes about, the Übermensch, right? And these ideas also had an influence on De Chirico. Because one of the things that Nietzsche said is that how do we discover what the Superman can be? Where do we find him in ourselves? Well, guess what? It was dreams, right? They reveal to us our true potential and our ability to become greater than we are. And he said that the dream is the place where the Superman lives, right? And this, in writing about his works, is what De Chirico said inspired him most to create these dreamscapes, was to try to get past reality to, right, this Nietzschean idea of a Superman. Okay. Brancusi, Constantine Brancusi, a surrealist before surrealism, in a way, right? He's in Paris already in 1903, beginning to investigate form by simplifying it. Now that's not extraordinary in the first decade of the 20th century to be simplifying to discover essence, right? That's Kandinsky, that's Malevich, Pete Mondrian, right? That's not extraordinary. But he's working almost exclusively with the human form and simplifying that into sort of spare, simple geometries, right? And also, of course, interested in sleep, in dreams. A muse inspires us, right? That's what a muse does. That's why we call them museums. It's where inspiration lives, right? It's in a museum. And a muse is that supernatural being that lies behind creation, right? Are the muses. And in ancient history, there were muses for different arts. There's the muse of history, right? There was the muse of artistic creation and so forth, right? And in this case, the muse is asleep, right? So is it suggesting that inspiration can come through sleep? Is it that his inspiration is asleep at this moment, right? But he works on this in multiple media. In this case, it's carved marble, but he also works with the exact same form in bronze as well, and in wood. Right? And as he simplifies the forms, what he's trying to get to is not only sort of the same thing that de Chirico is trying to get to with dreams, which is this place that's better than the physical world. But the other thing that Brancusi is trying to do is he's trying to reveal what he thinks is the true nature of the medium he's working with. Right? That there is something symbolic and meaningful about marble, period, regardless of what you carve from it. But there's something meaningful about bronze, regardless of what you carve from it. Wood. That each one of them has a characteristic. Right? And that characteristic comes to bear on the finished art object as much as the composition would, as much as the subject matter would. And on a certain level, I like this idea that we should be very careful. 5 out of 6 of you that make art in our studios here should be really careful about the works, the medium that we choose, and thinking about what we're trying to get out of it, because it has an impact, right? And you may not believe, like de Chirico, that there's some sort of metaphysical, spiritual, supernatural, surreal. By the way, supernatural, right? Surreal, supernatural, metaphysical. These are the same thing. There's some sort of supernatural essence to the medium. You may not buy into that, but you have to admit that there's certain media that are better for certain things than others are, and we need to be more careful about that, right? How we go about doing that. Well, again, I think he's getting to something that's primal, right? That's part of the whole Freudian dream analysis, is we're getting to something that's primal about us, about who we truly are, right? Going back to our childhood, going back to where we started through dreams, through memories. And Brancusi's going way, way back, right? This is prehistoric Greek art, right? We don't know anything about the people that lived on the Cycladic Islands. All we've got are these incredible geometric figures they left behind, that date prior to the development of Linear B writing, on the island of Knossos. We know that they lived on the islands around Greece, some of them on the mainland of Greece, but we don't know anything else about them. They are prehistoric. They had no written records. So these prototypes that obviously Brancusi is borrowing from have for him this shroud of mystery, right? They came out of a distant, lost culture that offers no insight into what they thought. They're just human. And maybe that's what Brancusi is trying to get to, is something that's purely human and shared with everybody. Hirshhorn's got a nice Brancusi. Here's in bronze. Again, that geometric simplification that Brancusi works with. I think he's looking back to Greek art, and then he's going to just absolutely simplify it. In many of his works, he designs the base as well. And he designs the base thinking about the different properties of the materials. And wood for him was a transition. It was the part of the earth that you can manipulate. And he always uses it at the bottom, right, to transition between the floor of the gallery and his works. But all of this, right, the hourglass, the geometric hourglass shape, the wooden block, the marble block on top of it, those are all designed by Brancusi as well. He does not see this work as something that you would put anywhere else, right? The sculpture is not just the torso, it's the entire thing, right? All of that designed. And that torso, as you can see, it's a torso without arms. It's a torso that's missing its legs from mid-thigh down. It's androgynous, right? We think it's probably based on fairly famous Greek sculpture. We've already seen him sort of channeling ancient Greece. The Apollo Belvedere is missing his arms, right? Missing legs from the knees down, and everybody knew this sculpture. When I was in art school, we had a full-size cast of this in the drawing studio, right? We drew from it all the time. And even missing his head, right? And Brancusi is taking that, and I guess he's also missing part of his genitalia, right? It's been knocked off as well. Brancusi's gone and one better, right? And turned it into this androgynous figure, right? Again, through simplification, so that we get to the pure essence and nature of the materials, right? Some people have argued it's not androgynous at all. That it's a big geometric penis. It's a phallus because of the way that he's rendered it. It's just an erect penis. And Brancusi himself denied this, right? He didn't like that interpretation, but people saw it in his stuff right away. And the next one is pretty shocking. It's a woman. It says a princess. It's supposed to be the neck of a woman with the head, and then her breasts down below. But it's quite obviously something else, right? And there's no doubt about it that this is it. And in fact, both Picasso and Matisse, when they saw this, said, "Oh my goodness, right? That's a phallus." And when he put it on display in the Anonymous Society's show, it was actually taken away for impropriety, right? The judges thought also this. But he wrote, no, it's the pure essence of the female form, he said, right? Well, this idea of simplification doesn't always end up erotic, right, or phallic. His most famous piece is The Bird in Space, where he's taken the theme of the bird and he's pared it down to its barest essential. The idea of flight, the motif of flying, he wants to capture that. What is a bird like in space? And look at the date on this. I mean, this looks like something out of the 60s. Like, that would be a NASA space program icon, you know? And he's arriving at this so early, and there's his base that he always uses, right? The wooden base down below with these geometric shapes, a cross shape in marble, on top of which there's a marble cylinder, and then there's this extraordinary, refined and fragile looking column that bends and swoops. It captures motion without actually moving, and captures sort of the essence of what it is to be a bird. I think you can tell by the people in the National Gallery here that it's really quite large. The actual bird itself, even without the base, is about 7 feet tall, right? And then up on the base, of course, it towers over you, and that's part of Brancusi's idea, because as you look at it and as your eye follows the bird to the top, you, of course, your eyes go to space, right? And you see it as if it were soaring and ascending skyward. Again, experimenting with materials, he does it in bronze as well, right? These are both in National Gallery right next to each other in the same gallery. And again, designing the base as part of the overall sculpture. And again, with each of these and their simplification, we're supposed to sort of focus on the brassness bronziness of the one on the left, the marbleness of the one on the right, and you begin to see the properties of the materials and what they do. Marble has an amazing sort of iridescent quality, right? As a stone, it's not really opaque. It's almost translucent, right? Not quite, but almost translucent. And you capture that. My picture doesn't capture that, but you capture that seeing it. And of course, with the bronze, you end up sort of focusing on that extraordinarily smooth surface. And we know with bronze, right, that you can treat it so that the surface looks different. That's part of what bronze casters do. When it comes out, right? Why are some bronze sculptures brown? And why are some like this? It's because of the way it's treated. He wants to treat it in this extraordinarily polished way. By the way, an earlier Brancusi from 1910 behind it, where he's still working with bird forms, right? And we can see how far in 15 years or so he comes with this. There's also this easy to miss, and again, my photo's kind of crappy here, but he's sliced off the top of it so that you get this beautiful sort of geometric parabola, oval, across the top. So again, geometry laying at the base of everything, right? Of course, he's got geometry as the base of this as well. Well, we'll wrap up surrealism by looking at the surrealist that Breton said was the most surrealist of us all. And that's Jean Miro. He's another Spaniard like Dali, but he is in France much, much earlier. He's there from the outset, right? And Breton loved his works, absolutely adored them, and said that they were, like I said, the most surrealist works out there. Where am I here? Right? He moved to Spain right already during the Dada period. He's there as early as 1920. He ends up going back to Spain to the family farm, which is what he illustrates here. When he got sick, he recuperated back on his family farm. And again, I think like Max Ernst, you get this idea of fever and illness leading to a sort of surreal vision of the world around you. And that's certainly the case here. He's illustrating his farm day or night, it's hard to say. And as he's illustrating it, in keeping with the idea of automatic writing, as he's illustrating, he's finding things within the illustration and stuff that he started to paint as a somewhat realistic image, through the course of the painting, turned into something extraordinary, something supernatural. Right? So we've got the barn on the left, we've got a chicken coop on the right, and that box is the front edge of the chicken coop, right? And you can see that he's omitted the chicken wire on the front of it so that we can see it. But it also renders that box as if it were something that's just drawn over the surface, almost like an illogical placement of a geometric shape. I've got a detail of that coming up. Right? And as we look inside the chicken coop, we see animals that are recognizable, cute little things they probably saw, on the farm, bunny rabbits, right? Wonderful rooster, colorful rooster. Who knows what that thing he's standing on is, right? With the red and the yellow. And then we start to look at things like the wood grain, and we start to see patterns begin to emerge within that. Very strange things start to appear out of the landscape. Even the way this fallen branch interacts with the ground around it has a sort of strange, sort of transformational quality. And if we look at the foreground in front of that, right, we see here snails and salamanders, a little rivulet of water, and these branches laying there, but they start to begin to almost like morph into something entirely different, right? Where the branches start to look like, I don't know, pipes, right, that you might play as musical instruments, and the hills of the ground, and they look almost like open books laying around. And then they just become something just odd about the animals that appear. That he's changed them around to where they violate perspective, they lay sort of flat on the surface, almost as if the salamander is crawling on the painting rather than on the ground, right? Or the snail itself, just that, I don't know, that crawlingness of nature begins to crawl all over everything. And even here at the edge of the coop, we start to see interesting patterns start to emerge as he tries to create this shape. Woman drawing water, unexplained idol perched behind her in the landscape, a horse with a mill behind, and then look at the extraordinary bark on that tree, right? And how the bark of the tree, he's finding within it, right? Things that he's transforming into other kinds of shapes. And then there's this mystery everywhere, right? Footsteps that stop. They just stop. Somebody's got that far and it's disappeared. Or who knows, maybe they've left this earth. Jesus rising to heaven. And a dog that's barking at nothing, right? I mean, my dogs do that too, right? They sit at the window and just bark. And my idea is they say, come play with me, right? Somebody's got to be out there. Come and play with me. But this one's looking like he's looking up into the tree. And there's nothing in the tree for him to be barking at. Is he barking at the moon? Right? That's kind of the direction he's looking. Is he barking at whoever's just disappeared? Right? There's almost this sense that they just sort of, right, ascended off of the earth, and the dog is recognizing that. The last thing I want to point to is the wall of the barn, and then we'll quit. He's painting this sort of stucco wall of the barn, and he's focusing on these cracks, and he's building up the edges around the cracks with the paint so that the crack is deeper on the surface of the panel than the stucco wall around it. But as he's painting it, he starts to see the moss, and he starts to focus on that moss, and it becomes this other sort of biomorphic form. And it looks like Dali's eyelash, actually, from The Persistence of Memory. And I think that Dali knows his works very, very well, knows his countryman Moreau's works. What we're going to see is that these forms that he's now locating in the family farm, in this very early work, become the forms that populate his more abstract works later. And what he's discovered as he's looking here are the basis for a language of forms that he'll deploy later. Right? And he's discovered them in this surrealist manner. Right? From kind of a start that transforms as you work on it. And it's forms that are based on his childhood, forms that are based on fever dreams. These become the forms that he will utilize through the rest of his career. We'll pick up with Miro and wrap up surrealism. It's a big movement, and we have to look at Picasso again because he kind of gets swept up into this in the 1920s, and a few other artists that get sort of wrapped up with surrealism. But that'll be for Monday. We'll have a chance to talk. So this weekend, right, you've got your paper to be working on. Good luck. If you have questions, email me, but obviously it's the weekend, so, I'm not necessarily sure I'll get back to you as quickly as I would during the week, but I will try to get back to you before Monday if you do that.